Hello everyone, this is Ishtar Babilu Dinga, the Naked Shaman, with episode 3 of these series of broadcasts about what's going on the world stage, but from perhaps a different viewpoint to one we're used to in the commentaries, in the news commentaries. And that's from the point of view of someone who practices shamanism, someone who journeys into other dimensions to get the guidance of the spirits in those dimensions. These are parallel dimensions that the shaman visits to get guidance, information, healing, and to bring it back to their community. The shaman's role is to protect the tribe, to protect the community. And all of these broadcasts are with a view to that, even though we will be straying into some quite controversial areas. And I would like to state as well that when I'm giving my political opinion, it is just my political opinion. The spirits don't take sides. There's no such thing as having God on your side. Everyone has God on their side. That's the truth of the matter. Everyone has the gods and goddesses on their side, including even the Jewish people. And the Jewish people is what I want to talk about today, because there is a very real problem now becoming apparent to most of us that the Jews, by the Jews I don't mean the Jewish people necessarily, but the Jews are being used to create havoc on the world stage in different ways by, let's call them, wolves in sheep's clothing. They're leaders who probably are no more Jewish, even if they're Jewish in their blood. In their sympathies, they're not necessarily Jewish. Their sympathies lie with greed and power, however they manage to achieve it. And so many of the, what I call Abrahamic ice cream religions, the Christianity, Judaism, Islam, were formed, they were all cut from the same piece of cloth, the Abrahamic cloth. And they were created specifically at the beginning of the Common Era to divide and rule and to enable those in power over us, the bloodlines in power over us, to always have us fighting each other, basically. And so a lot of the feeling that's being ratcheted up against the Jews on the world stage at the moment is part of that. The other thing they do is use a weapon, and the weapon is called the fear of anti-Semitism. So whenever these wolves in sheep's clothing who have taken over the Jewish cause havoc, cause pain, cause absolute terrible atrocities on the world stage, and other people turn around and criticize them, they are called anti-Semitic. And it used to be the most feared term, especially since we were taught all about the Holocaust in Germany, in which we were taught 6 million Jewish people were gassed to death. There's different research coming out about that now, but again, you can't even discuss this research that's coming out, which is based on firm evidence, without being called anti-Semitic. And then everyone retreats and the problem doesn't get solved. This is because the people that are in charge of the Jewish people don't want the problem to be solved. And calling, someone anti-Semitic is just throwing the ball into the long grass so that then nothing gets discussed, nothing gets sorted out. And I believe that this question of the Jewish people does have to be sorted out if we are to enter into an age of peace on the world stage. They have to be looked after. They haven't been well looked after so far. I'm talking about the rank and file Jewish people. They've been used. They've been used as a political football, and they're still being used today. They're being used to force through another agenda, which is probably not even one that they're aware of. But the plans for a greater Israel in the Middle East look suspiciously like the plans for the greater caliphate of ISIS. And it's interesting to note that ISIS never attacks Israel. So that should tell us something. The Jewish people are being bounced around by their leaders just as much as we're bounced around by our leaders. I heard the other day that Tony Blair is, thank goodness, stepping down from his Middle East peace envoy role. Tony Blair is the former Prime Minister of Britain, the one that took us with Bush into the Iraq War, and on the pretext that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It was a complete lie from start to finish. And, it was just a pretext to get us into Iraq. And over 1 million civilians, not even soldiers, but civilians, were murdered by the Allied forces during that war. And for that reason, many in this country want him brought to trial as a war criminal. Interestingly, at the same time, there is a petition going through on the internet for Benjamin Netanyahu to also be tried as a war criminal if he enters Britain. That petition has now reached 65,000, and if it reaches 100,000, it will have to be debated in the Houses of Parliament, which would be quite interesting. I think we should all... I'm not one for signing petitions, but I'm quite tempted to sign that one because it would be very interesting to see that debated in the Houses of Commons. So there we are. We have everybody shrieking at each other, either they're a war criminal and then the war criminals are shrieking back at us that we're anti-Semitic for accusing them of such. Really, this anti-Semitic thing can be taken apart quite easily. Once you realise that the Semitic races are not so called because of genes, but because of language. The Semitic races are those that speak a Semitic language, and this includes all Arabs, including those that live in Palestine. So Israel is attacking other Semites in Semitic-speaking peoples in Palestine, while accusing anyone that criticises them for doing this as being anti-Semitic. I think you can see that there's some real hypocrisy there. And not only that, but the ruling classes in Israel are the Ashkenazi Jews, who there is some doubt that they are even ever from a Semitic-speaking race. And certainly the language spoken now by most people in Israel, the main language is modern Hebrew. And this is a reconstruction of Hebrew that was probably never spoken in about the 3rd century BCE. When I say BCE, I mean before Common Era. It used to be called before Christ, but it's now a much more secular term, before Common Era. And then after that is called Common Era. That used to be called Anno Domini, after Christ, but now we call it Common Era. So that's BCE is before Common Era and CE is Common Era. So in about the 3rd century BCE, the language, which was Hebrew, was changed to Aramaic. Well, the Jews lived in that part of the world for a long time after that. The diaspora, which is when they were sent, all around the world in exile, was during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. So by the time they were leaving Jerusalem, Israel, they were speaking Aramaic, not Hebrew. And I think this is very interesting because if you also look at modern Hebrew, it's a reconstruction of a priestly language that was never really spoken. It was used or just among the priestly castes, in the same way that Sanskrit was used among the Indian priestly castes. The priestly castes had their own language, and that's what Old Hebrew was. So the ruling classes in Israel are the Ashkenazi Jews, and when they got there, they were mainly speaking Yiddish, which has more German in it than Hebrew. So let's talk about how it all came about, how this problem came about. The land in Palestine, and it had been called Palestine since Roman times, was partitioned off and given to the Jews from Europe after the so-called Holocaust. They were given their own land to live in, which they hadn't had since they'd been banished from Jerusalem and their temple destroyed by the Romans in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. So they hadn't been there on that land for nearly 2,000 years. And they went, although some did remain, it's true, some did remain there, but mostly the Ashkenazi Jews that went from Europe and Russia were going there for the first time. Their families had never lived there. They hadn't lived there for a long time. So they went back. They were given this land and they went back. And from then on, it seems to me, they've just been very, very, very unhappy with this small segment of land that they've been given, because they are surrounded by Semites, Semitic-speaking peoples that they don't relate to, because they are much more European in their outlook. This is the way it seems to me. There are some that say that the Ashkenazi Jews are so called because they actually originated with the Khazarians, and the Khazarians dominated Central Asia for many years up until about the 5th century CE, and then they started moving. They were like marauding tribes, actually. They do have a very aggressive expansionist way of behaving, a bit like the Vikings. And so they marauded their way into Europe. And then they took on the religion of Judaism. So once you have all this information, it really explains quite a lot. The people dictating this expansionist policy in Israel, the affluent class of Israel, are Ashkenazis, who probably have no links to that land at all, but are using it. And the Jews that are the sort of underclass there are the original Jews, are the Middle Eastern Jews. And I wouldn't say it was apartheid as such. I think that's probably putting it too strongly. But there are these, there is this underclass of Mizrahi Jews who are the original Semitic-speaking Jews. They are not the Ashkenazis. And they have long complained of discrimination by the European-descended elite. And this elite has traditionally dominated government, military and business institutions. There are more of those type of Mizrahi, I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right, Mizrahi Jews in prison, for example, than Ashkenazi Jews. And the Ashkenazi Jews far outnumber the Mizrahim in academia. The Mizrahim also account for most of the poor people. They live in the poorest towns, and they are, basically being used, I believe, by these Ashkenazis, who I don't blame either. I blame the people that are leading the Ashkenazis, who probably aren't even, you couldn't even probably even call them Ashkenazis. They are Zionists, they are linked to the CIA as much as our leaders are. We're all being used, that's the point I'm trying to make. So accusing each other of anti-Semitism is really a waste of time, and it is just to distract us from what's really happening, where these wolves in sheep clothing have infiltrated the sheep and are making them run wherever they want them to run, are chasing them here, there and everywhere. So this is the problem of the world. And I really would like to have a discussion about this. I would like to have a discussion where we're not name-calling. And by the way, I'd like to say now, if anybody sends a comment about me being anti-Semitic, I won't publish it, because obviously if you do that, then you haven't heard what I'm saying. You haven't bothered to listen to what I'm saying, so it's not worth publishing your comment. In recent years, the hardline policy of Netanyahu has meant that he has been behaving in an extremely anti-Semitic fashion, because he has been attacking in no uncertain times the Palestinians who are Semitic speakers, who are mainly Arabs, who are Semitic speakers. So I hope this is understood now. I want to also talk about another problem. I think we really do need to discuss this Jewish problem so that we can maybe start to say, okay, so what should we do about it? What are the possible solutions? They're obviously not happy on that land that they were given after the Second World War. They possibly because they are surrounded by people they don't relate to, that they feel threatened by, that make them feel paranoid. And that paranoia is used by the wolves to declare war on the Palestinians, on the Iranis, on anybody, in fact, that threatens the Jewish agenda. I don't have any answers. I think as we were talking about last week, the only way really to find a solution to any problem is to identify the problem. And at the moment, all the name calling is stopping us from identifying the problem. And the problem probably is that these people are in the wrong place, or their needs are not being taken care of in a way that suits the highest good of all and brings harm to no one. They are being used to create war in the Middle East. They are being used like a wedge. We talk about the thin end of the wedge. They are the thin end of the wedge of Western defense, euphemism, Western attack policy in the Middle East. You could say that they are the point of the arrow that's being fired. They are being used just as much as we're being used to pay for it. So I want to talk a little bit more about this today, and my main aim is really just to open up the debate about what really is the answer, because for my whole life, and probably yours, the narrative of the Jews has dominated everything, has dominated our lives, beginning with the guilt that we were taught to feel over the Holocaust, even though none of us actually alive today had anything to do with that Holocaust. And now we're seeing that the numbers are not anything like the Jews were saying. Not that that justifies it by any means, but it is beginning to look as if many of these so-called death concentration camps were in fact work camps, no different to the work camp my father was in for 5 years. He was in a prisoner of war camp, very close to a Jewish camp, in fact. He was in Stalag 8B, which is now in Poland, in Katarina. And he told me a lot, but he's also written a book about this, actually, which I'll put a link to at the end, about his time in the prisoner of war camp. And you can see, even though it was mainly Allied prisoners of war, Allied soldiers, it was really not a lot different to the camps that the Jews were put in, because they were all work camps. My father was forced to work down the mines for the Germans. He was in this camp for 5 years. When he came out, he looked like a skeleton, just like many Jews did. He looked like a walking skeleton, because they were starving, but so were the guards starving. This is what we're never told, because the Allies were destroying, bombing the train lines, bringing in the food. And so everyone was starving. That's why you see so many of these skeletal-looking men. And yes, people did die of hunger. And many of the Jews died of typhus as well. It was a terrible, terrible atrocity that happened. We can still call it a Holocaust, whether it was 1 million or 6 million. But it wasn't meant to be. It was a mistake that so many died, is what's coming out now, because we're finding that there's evidence. I mean, it is very well evidenced if you choose to put down the emotional programming and actually look at the paperwork, that the Jews and people like my father, like the Allied prisoners, were needed to work to support the German war effort. Because German, in our countries, the women went to work and worked in the factories and helped make the bombs and worked on the land and did they were a massive support to the war effort. But in Germany, the German women didn't have that tradition of working or didn't want to work for whatever reason. They had a different way of doing things. And so everybody was needed for the war effort. They didn't want to kill the Jews because they wanted them as slaves. And, that's still a crime. So this is not to take anything away from what the Jewish people suffered during the wars, during both wars, but specifically the Second World War. But, my father suffered too, and so did millions of servicemen suffer in work camps and suffer through lack of food, lack of care, suffer from the cold. The camp my father was in was Silesia, which was extremely cold. They had very long and bitter winters there. And, there was no heating, and they were sleeping on planks of wood, basically. That's their beds. They considered themselves lucky if they had enough planks to make a bed. It was a terrible thing that many, many people suffered. And as we now know, the war need never have happened anyway, because Hitler had no intention of invading, certainly our country, in England. And the countries he did invade was because he considered that they were part of the Rhineland. There's no excuse for any of it. They were all just evil people out to make money. But the fact is that there were American banks and American industrialists also financing both sides of that war. Just as there is today, English and American financiers and bankers funding both sides of what goes on in the Middle East. So we have to start now looking at how we get used and how different events are not what we were told that they were. I'm going to put some links to some further information on this, because I'm probably not the best person to talk about it. There are people that have devoted really their lives to researching this and their safety to researching it. They are in considerable danger because they are publishing the truth of these matters about this Jewish agenda that has dominated our lives for so long. And we will never, in my view, be able to bring any kind of peaceful solution on this earth until this agenda is recognised, is brought out into the open, that people are allowed to openly discuss it without fear of being locked up or killed, or called anti-Semitic. And we need to sort it. It needs to be sorted. Another one I just want to mention, I'm going to give links to all that I've just talked about, so you'll be able to follow up on it. But I also want to talk about this idea about Babylon, because this is also part of this Jewish agenda. And I know there are many commentators on the alternative media who talk about the bad guys, the banksters, as Babylon. They say, this has been going on since the times of Babylon and we have to change it. Once again, we are being blinded, we're being distracted from the true cause of this problem by being told that it's Babylon. If you do ask any of those commentators where they got the idea of Babylon from and which, what is their source, what is their historical source for saying that everything comes from Babylon, all the problems come from Babylon, they don't know. They're just repeating like parrots what they've been told to say. Because it sounds good, It sounds good because we've been taught to fear Babylon. Who would have taught us to fear Babylon, do you think? Well, if you think about it, the Jews the Jews have had a whole story of exile. Their whole history is riddled with exile and exodus. Some of it true, some of us we're not really sure if it is true, if it's just mythological. But the story of the Babylonian exile is well known because there is that song that many of us know about the rivers of Babylon, how they sat down and cried and when they remembered Zion, which was their homeland, because they were made exile in Babylon. And this was in the 5th century BCE. So by the rivers of Babylon is a section in my book, The Sacred Sex Rites of Ishtar. And I talk about this exodus or exile into Babylon, and I want to give you a flavour of it because it really does help us to understand why this psyop or mind programming about Babylon has come about. Because in actual fact, we're ruled by 13 bloodlines, 13 royal bloodlines that actually don't come from Babylon. They don't go back that far. They come from, and this is some research from David Livingstone in Terrorism and the Illuminati. But it's also, I've taken it and put it in my book. So there are these 4 families that came from, first of all, the House of Shaman, which arose in Antioch about 162 BCE. Secondly, the House of Herod, that is Herod Agrippa, who was the friend of Caligula, the Roman emperor. Thirdly, the Julio-Claudio-Roman dynasty. And fourthly, the priest kings of Baal in Emesa, which is known today as Hims in Syria. And then these 4 were later joined by the Ashkenazi Jews, who we think were Khazars from Central Asia that converted to Judaism around the 8th or 9th centuries. And then they gradually moved into Russia and Europe. So these are the families that rule us. But they have a reason for demonizing Babylon, which I do explain, I go into great detail about in chapter 7 of my book, because the reason is actually to do with shamanism, is actually to do with magic. And even today, they are wanting to destroy Babylon, and they have more or less achieved that. But it isn't, we're given a geopolitical reason for the destruction of Babylon. In fact, it's an occult reason. And I explain all of this in chapter 7 of my book, The Sacred Sex Rites of Ishtar. Ishtar was a Babylonian goddess. She's who the Jews called the whore of Babylon. And they demonized her and demonized Babylon in their books because of their feeling of being exiled in Babylon. And for that reason, in the same way, I think you'll find, that there were people that were in German prisoner of war camps that maybe don't like the Germans today. They have a natural antipathy towards the Germans, let's say, because they were in German prisoner of war camps. In the same way, because the Jews were actually very well treated in Babylon, and they wrote their Babylonian Talmud as a result of it. They were allowed to develop their philosophy of, that's come down to us in the Hermetica, of the Kabbalah in Babylon. And then they were released by the Persian king Cyrus, not long, they were just there for a few decades. Then they came back to Jerusalem. I think we really have to, if we're going to be talking to other people in the alternative media and taking a role of leading and guiding people, we really have to start guiding them properly and not be lazy and just repeat terms like Babylon when we don't really know what we're talking about when we say it. I would also like to see the shamans within the Judaic tradition starting to help their people, because that is the role of the shaman. The shaman's role is to help their own people. And I would like to start to see that happen. I'd like to start to see it happen actually with all shamans. I think at the moment there's a problem with shamanism in that it's slightly removed and it's sort of away in a niche cupboard somewhere that people like to get up and get out their bits and pieces from this cupboard and examine it on weekends at workshops, It's a bit dusty. It needs dusting off and bringing into the modern age, because the role of the shaman was always to protect the tribe. And by that, I don't mean going into battle at the head of the tribe, because that would be silly to do that. We can't take them on that way. We have to be cleverer than that. And the shamans are cleverer than that if they are really practicing their craft. Perhaps the most recent shaman that did that was Geronimo. And that's why, he was an Apache. And that's why he's so loved. Today, the name Geronimo conjures up this image of someone who really fought for his people. But he didn't do it in a direct way. He did it in an indirect way, in the way that the shaman knows how to do. The Jewish people really need our help. They need to be rescued from these warmongers. And all of us actually need to be rescued from these warmongers. And for that reason, we shouldn't waste our time accusing each other. Let's all band together and accuse the warmongers, the people that really are the problem, the 1%, because that's the one thing they fear, and it's why they keep distracting us with all these other mind programming operations that are nothing to do with the past, that are nothing to do with what really happened. So I hope this has been of some help. It is a really complex subject. We couldn't possibly solve it today. I would, if I could, just see that this term anti-Semitic just drops out of fashion, I would be happy to see that, because then at least a discussion can start and the source of the problem can be examined freely by the researchers that are already doing it at great risk to themselves. And I'm putting myself at risk even in making this broadcast at some risk. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.